Extract 9, Vincent Frankenstein. Date, 1800s. For months now, I have been writing normal entries into this diary. Tales of walks in the park, visits with those who might be able to help with the change in our society, and most recently, the worries about Mary's health. She has been having severe headaches and fainted several times in the last weeks. Doctors do not know why this has happened. I was loath to leave her, but she, being strong, had the courage to convince me to go and do the right thing. All this upheaval couldn't have come at a more inconvenient time. Of the months we have been together, my hopes for returned affection came true. I married Mary not 5 days ago in a chapel in London, and am now with Joan Idaho Thatcher drifting over the Atlantic Ocean in a flying ship. It all began, or should I say continued, on the evening of our wedding day. It was a peaceful and quiet ceremony. We had cut ties with our families to keep our privacy and their safety. John was to return at some future point to tell us the monstrous women had been taken care of. He did return, but on the evening of our wedding day, spoiling our lovely day with bad news. Mary looked like an angel all in white, and a complete contrasting vision compared to when she was with those monsters. It is painful to think about them again, and what I must do. After the wedding, we arrived at our new home to spend our first night together, having done our best to enjoy our day and forget Mary's ill health for a short time. But as we settled to eat our supper, a loud rat-a-tat-tat knocking came from our front door. Its urgency put us both on edge. Who could that be on this night of all nights? Mary whispered to me across the table. I don't know. John, I replied, my hope making my voice rise. Or something much worse, Mary said. I nodded firmly at her cautious and wise words. What she said stuck in my mind. I crept quietly and found the pistol and rifle that we kept under the stair cupboard. The rifle I gave to Mary, who waited beyond the doorway in the dining room. I took the pistol and went to discover who was making such a disturbance. The loud knocks continued until I got to the door. I held my breath and listened. Vincent? Mary? Are you there? It's John, came the old familiar twang. I relaxed, let out of breath, and opened the door. John stood in his long leather coat and wide-brimmed hat, the raindrops rolling off the rim. I moved back quickly to give him room to enter. I'm sorry, Vincent. He strode into the house, the pearl-white eye scanning the room as his normal eye fixed on me. I know it's your special day, and I didn't want to disrupt the ceremony, but I have waited long as I can. I need you to come with me. Mary stood in the hallway at the doorway of the dining room. I'm sorry, ma'am, John said, taking off his hat to reveal golden yet scraggly hair, which was longer than I remembered. His previously trimmed stubble had not been kept in check for several weeks, and had become the beginning of a beard. I know this is not the way you had planned to spend your evening, but we will all need to leave. There have been complications with my task. What complications? I asked, frustrated at John's intrusion, and yet fearful at the thought of the monsters. There's no time to explain, John continued. I will tell you both the story on our way. I looked at Mary. Her health had to come first. I was torn between telling John that it was not our problem anymore, for he said he would deal with it, and the weight of this responsibility I felt because it was my father who had unleashed these death-dealing monsters on the world. What did strike me in that moment was that I didn't feel the reassurance and confidence that I had when John had met me at the bar. With that thought, I knew something was very wrong. He wouldn't ask for our help unless he really needed it. With a sigh, I turned to Mary. Go, she said before I could say anything. The only way we are ever going to have peace and continue our work for equality is if this problem is solved. Just promise me you will try to reason with them. You really should come too, Mary, John insisted. Your insight and perspective will be needed, and clearly you can hold your own if the worst happens, he added, looking at the rifle. I would, John, but my health has not been good recently. I have more tests with the doctors soon, and though it pains me not to embark on this task, it is best I stay here. As she said these words, she turned to me. I know you are scared, my love, but you have more courage than you know. I will be well and safe, so let that thought be a comfort to you. I don't want to leave you, I replied. I love you too much. I know, she replied, but this is the right thing, and I have a feeling you will learn things that will help us both and our journey. I will be here when you get back. Don't worry about me. I'm sorry to hear you're unwell, John interjected. I was really hoping to have your insight and determination on this journey. I hope the doctors can heal you. However, we must be going, Vincent. Hold on, I said firmly. What's happened? You said you would sort this out. I tried, John said, with an apologetic rub of his stubble. But I hope maybe you can convince them where I failed. We will try again, but we will also need to be more prepared than I was. I looked to Mary again. I'll be fine, Vincent. Go with John. Nodding my acceptance of the situation, I quickly strode to her and kissed her gently. I will see you soon, she said, taking the pistol from my hand. I turned back to John, unable to say anything as my emotions caught in my throat. Thank you, he said, opening the door and walking back out into the rain. I took my long coat from the stand next to the door and followed him. He was already halfway down the street, so I buried my fears about Mary's health and quickly ran into the night, catching up with him and ignoring the cold rain that dripped onto me and splashed around my feet. Where are we going? I asked as I tried to match his long, purposeful strides. To the church, he pointed. To the church? Why? A lump formed in my chest. Back to the church so soon after my vows. It seemed so strange and alien, and was certainly not the custom I was expecting this evening. John's interruption had jolted me back to that fateful night in the bar, all those months ago, and here I was, acquiescing to his requests with no question or argument. Father, even now your creations, those monsters haunt me. I need this to be over. You'll see, John said, giving no further explanation, and interrupting my thoughts. I did not press him, but I was curious and anxious to know what riled him, and why he wanted my help. Not that I knew how I could be of any help to someone who had such weaponry, as I had seen the last time I was in his company, but there I was, following him. John led us into the church. I was grateful to be out of the rain, and our footsteps echoed loudly as we walked towards the altar at the far end of the room. My companion pushed open a wooden door that led to a stone spiral staircase. We passed 2 doors on our ascent, and as we reached the third, John opened it and stepped out into the top of the church's steeple. Then, to my horror, he stepped out into the thin air. I was about to shout in fear, but his feet planted as if on solid ground, and cut my exclamation short. He turned and gave me a playful grin. I'm sorry, he said. I just couldn't resist. He let out a little chuckle. The look on your face is priceless. I locked my jaw. I didn't think it was very fair of him to use me to amuse himself. But I knew, or at least continued to believe, that John was a good man despite his odd and mysterious ways and behaviour. After a moment's hesitation to compose myself from the initial shock of him standing in thin air, and to let my feeling pass, I tried to give a jovial smile. How are you doing that? I asked as he continued to stand in empty sky. Take my hand, follow my footsteps, and you'll see, he said as he held out his right hand. I grasped it and followed where he had trod. There was a semi-solid surface beneath my feet that flexed as though it could have been wood. John then led me forward a few more paces and, giving me a reassuring look, let go and jumped forward. My nerves were on edge again, but he encouraged me with a beckoning hand. I gathered all my courage and followed. The moment I jumped, the supposed invisible air around us took form. Colours of solid objects bombarded my eyes and materialized as I indeed landed on a hard wooden floor. I felt the rain stop too, and stared with wonder. With the view of London stretched out before me, and the way I had to stand in a wide stance with a slight sway as the floor moved, I knew we were on some sort of flying contraption. I thought I must be on the deck of some sort of ship-like structure, but I looked around the railing and the dips and rises of the side, and how the front lurched up, and seeing the carving of the wood main and the steps that ran up into what looked like ears either side of the stairs, I realized we were on the saddle deck of a giant wooden horse. I breathed heavily with bewilderment, and my eyes followed the ropes ascending from the ears. Above me was a giant canopy of lead webbing, which surrounded a huge material balloon. I saw that the balloon curved at either end, creating an oval shape there was more ropes, spaced at intervals that kept it tied to the wooden horse we were on. Open-mouthed, I turned to John, and he nodded his understanding of my awe. Here, you better sit down. He smiled as he pointed to a chair and table nearby, which looked both completely out of place and yet perfectly at home on this flying horse. I staggered over to the chair, my legs feeling weak. The sudden thought that I was so high up in a strange flying horse ship was so foreign to all my natural senses that I felt queasy. Birds should fly, yet here we were in something that was made for flying humans around. I sat down and took several deep breaths. Fortunately, John interrupted my fears and spoke before I could ask any of the hundreds of questions that were trying to take form in my mind. "I need to set us off, then I'm all yours," he said, and with that I watched as he went off to work. He was more relaxed now than he had been when he had come to my house. Being here seemed to calm him, and he was back to the John Idaho Thatcher I remembered. John went to the side of the saddle deck that was adjacent to the church steeple, and I noted several ropes tied to the steeple. He put his left hand on the railings, and the ropes came free, as if by themselves, and reeled into the side of this flying horse. It is hard for me to know which words to use to describe this thing we were on, so forgive my failings in this regard. But flying balloon horseship Zeppelin is the best I can do. With the ropes free from the stone architecture, the wind pulled us, and I held onto the table as John ran to the front of the ship. His long leather coat whipped as he bounded up the stairs, onto the main, and once at the top he put a hand on each ear, and the horse moved forward against the wind on a steady course. The wind and rain lashed John, but he remained steadfast, and after about 10 minutes of following the same course, and of me collecting my thoughts and questions, I heard John walking down the steps ahead of me. I looked up, and he sat down tiredly, slumping into the chair opposite me. "I take it we're safe?" I asked. "I've set the steering to hold our current course, and the engines below will power us forward for now." "Engines below?" "There are several decks below us," he answered, and pointed to the tail. I glanced back and saw a hatch that could be pulled up, which I guessed must open to a ladder or stairs. "The very bottom has an engine room, and it powers my humble abode." "You live here?" I asked. "Every cowboy needs his steed, and this is how I choose to live while doing what I do." I shook my head in amazement. "And what is exactly that you do again?" "The short version is research, and to keep balance between the seemingly infinite possibilities of reality. It's like this," he continued, as he saw my blank expression. There are other worlds that follow the same timeline as this world, but each is different, as each are subject to the possible variations in choice and circumstance. As you can imagine, the number of possible worlds is vast beyond our understanding. Infinite, some would say, if they didn't know better. I am a scriptorian, and as such I have the responsibility of exploring and recording the wonders that I see on the relatively few worlds I get to explore in my lifetime. I have come to favour your version of Earth, and part of my responsibility is to protect humanity from any such difficulties that come with certain choices, consequences, and the outcomes that are possible. This includes the monitoring of the creations of new life forms, such as the ones your father brought to life, although these are different to anything that I have come across before. I also have to report and regulate any worlds that are home to those who have learned to travel to alternate realities, and deal with the damage this can cause. Lastly, I get the opportunity to have a small influence on those people I meet on my adventures, and perhaps guide them to reach their potential, or help them change their world for the better. There was a twinkle in his eye as he finished, and I took advantage of the silence, trying to digest this fantastical tale. "That's the simple version," I said finally. John chuckled and nodded. "I have told you what I can, so that you understand the basics of what we are about to do. The story we are part of is all that really matters. As we make our journey, I'll answer your questions about what has happened to bring me here, and ask for your help. We have a bit of a journey ahead of us, so there's time to dissect my tale. So I can't ask about how you control this, or how it was invisible, or how it moves. Remember that some things aren't important right now. I know with a detailed explanation and enough time to study them, you would understand, but we must focus on what matters and what's important to us right now." "I'm sorry," I replied. "So what happened after we left you? Where did you go? And what happened with my father's creation? John frowned and rubbed the side of his face, then shook his head and forced a smile. I left that same day to find your father's creations and to watch them. I wanted to observe them and find a way to save them, rather than destroy them. Even though they had hurt and killed many men, it was my wish to convince them of another path. All life is precious, Vincent, and I wanted to fix all that had happened. I know I implied I would destroy them, but I had to at least look for another option first. I know you understand this now. I nodded that I did. I took this, my flying zeppelin, he continued, and used it to search from the skies and traced your directions back to the clearing. There I found several fresh graves, and using my eye, he pointed to the milk-white eye, I saw that one was the large fetus of a child with a bullet in its forming head. I wondered how he could see such things through the earth, but did not press him. With a heavy heart, I tracked the obvious signs of a large group's movement to the east, and I came across them in another town. I had been too late, and all the men were broken, piled up in a pyramid of death. I circled in from the air and found where the creations had settled. I saw the cruelness of their action from the dead bodies, but I still held out hope that I could persuade them to change, or maybe take them from this world to somewhere they couldn't harm anyone anymore. I still hold that hope, Vincent, and you'll see why soon. He paused and rubbed his face again. His one good eye clouded with the thought and memory. I realized then I was holding my breath and leaning forwards towards him, hanging on his every word. I landed on the outskirts of the town, holstered my pistol, and put an eye patch on to cover my special eye. I can see things, even through an eye patch, but I didn't want them to see its strangeness. It causes too many questions. I covered the dove on my chest with my leather coat, but hoped the influence it has on people's emotions to make them trust me, or give them confidence in me, would work. I left my hat behind, though. It's only for show, and he grinned. Then I strode into the town. What happened to the dove on your chest? I interrupted, as I realized he was not wearing it. Perhaps its absence was why I did not feel as reassured with him as I had previously. Ah, yes, John said with a guilty shrug. I'll tell you that when we come to it, but I have a quick confession. I used it to influence you when we first met. His face tightened as he winced apologetically. It's how I deterred you from following me to stop the matriarch first time around. I knew it must have affected me somehow, I said. I thought I trusted you more than I would have, and haven't felt the same this time around. I'm sorry, John continued. I prefer to work alone if I can. It's just less complicated that way. I also prefer not to put people in danger if it can be helped. Can you forgive me? I thought for a moment, looked him in the eye. Of course I can, I replied as I saw the genuine desire to help. Thank you. I'm glad I still have your trust. I'll continue the story, shall I? I nodded. I decided to take a direct approach. I walked through the main street, and many of the women in red dresses came out of the wooden houses to look at me. I was glad they did not attack me. They did shout and jeer, though, telling me I was going to meet my death for coming here. But they stayed back. Perhaps they knew I was different. I paid them no attention, and walked to the large guest house where the matriarch... He paused, and looked up at me for confirmation. I nodded, and he continued. The matriarch and her offspring housed themselves. They were waiting for me as I strode up, with several of their human counterparts at their sides. We stood facing each other for a time. I saw that the largest, who I knew must be the matriarch, had patched up the dark red dress in several places where she had been shot. The damage had obviously been minimal, and I was grateful for the pistol at my hip. Two of the daughters, who were still pregnant, stood behind her, and I wondered where the other, who had lost a child, was. It was with this thought that the matriarch finally spoke. You know you are about to die. Her daughters and the women around her, and those gathering behind me, laughed cruelly. I will not deny I started to worry a little at this point, but with some honest talk I felt they would realize they didn't have to do what they were. I won't die here today, I called, and readied my hand in case I needed to draw my weapon. I am not from this world, I continued. I can offer you a new life, where you don't have to be a part of such bloodshed. A life without these other humans in a place that will be yours. I can give you this if you want it. You can change. Whatever has happened to you to make you hate men, I'm sorry, but we are not all bad. I could see anger and a desire to silence my words in the matriarch, but she did not attack me. I raised my voice so more of the women around me could hear. It may look like the men are trying to control women, and that you are treated like servants, but it's not the case everywhere. For what I can see on this world, it won't be long before things begin to change and a state of equality will emerge and continue to grow. But it won't happen if you continue to kill all who displease you, or create a war between men and women, because that is where this road leads. There will be no happiness, no joy, no peace if you don't stop this. There is hope. There is a chance. Even now, one of those who was here with you has begun to change the heart of a man and show him this inequality can be abolished. She is showing him through kindness and education. We do not want equality, the matriarch interrupted. We want control. It is our turn to have the power. There is no other way but violence. You men, and the wars you have always fought, have taught us this. Even if we wanted equality, it still couldn't be achieved without violence. Maybe so, I interrupted back, but this is not your choice to make. You may be in the form of a woman, but you are not the same as them. You are something more durable and stronger. It is not your fight. I promise you that things can change for these women and for you, but you should not shape their path for them. Will you talk with me? I can tell you about how you can have your own place away from the pain you have had to endure already. These women need to forge their own road, as do you. John trailed off and looked across at me. I really thought I had been getting through to them, Vincent, but these were the wrong words, and the matriarch roared when I said this. His brow furrowed, and he shook his head slightly and sighed. The matriarch sneered at me then, hissing and spitting with anger as she spoke. I will not leave my sisters to the men who neglect them and treat them as lesser beings. How dare you try to manipulate me? This is why men should be punished. And with that, she came at me with her hands held up to grab me. I quickly drew my pistol, turned it to the highest stun setting, and shot. The blue ball hit her in the chest, but did almost nothing. As the energy of the shot dispersed through her, she paused for a second, but it should have stopped her dead in her tracks. And then she continued towards me. I had no time to change the power setting, and so I turned and ran in the only direction available, towards the pile of dead men. I heard shouts and screams behind me, and knew they would be on me in moments. I opened my coat and pressed the white dove on my chest. It tells the Zeppelin to come for me. I holstered my gun as I continued to run and waited for the Zeppelin to come. Heavy footsteps echoed behind me as I passed the twisted bodies of dead men, but suddenly I heard the whistle from my chest and looked up to see the rope of my Zeppelin descending in front of me. Well, I saw the Zeppelin too, even though it was invisible to everyone else. As I always do, thanks to this. He pointed to his milk-white eye again and winked. Once again, I wondered how that was possible, but so much of John was incredible and miraculous, I knew better than to try to get an answer. I nodded for him to continue. At the same time, I heard squelching and grinding noises from where the dead men were. The stomps and cries from behind me stopped dead, and I could not help but turn to see what had happened. To my horror, the bodies of the dead men were squirming and crawling along the ground, and coiling themselves from each other. Those who could started to stand. I shook my head in disgust and confusion, and turned to the matriarch and those behind her. They too looked on in bewilderment, and ever so slight horror. The rope now dangled beside me, but I had to watch and see what was happening, and to know how the dead could walk once more. A few moments passed, and the matriarch and her two daughters turned to me. The matriarch readied herself to lunge at me again, but a loud simultaneous groan from the hundreds of dead men stopped her. At first it was incomprehensible, but as it was repeated twice more, I made out the slurred word which came from the animated dead. "Mother," they groaned. "Mother," they repeated again and again. I was disgusted and horrified at the grotesque scene, and the eerie croaking word made me realize that somehow it was the proximity of your father's creation that had caused them to rise. They were calling to her. I faced her again and she smiled wickedly. "Get him," she called, pointing at me. The dead clambered at me before I realized what was happening. I came to my senses just before they grabbed me and reached for the rope, but it was too late. 3 of the undead creatures latched onto me and pulled. The only choice I had was to reach for my pistol. Thankfully, I got a hold of it. Not knowing if it would work, I shot. To my relief, it blew a hole in the undead men, and they fell back. I quickly shot the other 2 that grabbed me. They fell back, and I scrambled away from them as more rolled over them to try and take me. I tried to grab the rope, but between shooting at the undead and the confusion, I missed and tripped. Before I knew it, my arms were pinned by the dead men, and I was being held down. My pistol was ripped from my hand, and I knew it was over. I knew I had failed. I watched as the towering image of the matriarch came into view, and she cradled my pistol, which looked like a toy in her giant hand. She smiled cruelly at me. "And now you die, strange man." "Wait," came a voice from behind her, and then I saw one of the pregnant daughters come into view. "Remember what he said, mother," the daughter said. "This man is different. The things he spoke of about another world for us, and this strange weapon may be important to us. You saw what it did to these our new dead slaves. It stopped them. And where does the rope lead that is floating in the air?" She pointed, and I panicked. I didn't want them to be able to climb that rope and get to my home. With all my strength, I pulled one of my hands free and punched the dove on my chest twice, and the rope ascended. "Quick, seize it," the matriarch roared, but neither the undead men nor the daughters were quick enough, and the rope withdrew from us and then vanished. My arm was yanked back and held by several of the dead men, their gruesome, bloody and broken faces leering over me, and I sighed with relief. They could not reach the Zeppelin now, so even if I did die, they had no access to all the secrets on board in my books. "Curse you," the daughter cried as she turned to me. "Where did the rope lead to?" I kept quiet and closed my eyes. I had no choice but to accept my fate now. My silence only angered the daughter and the matriarch. "Stand him up," the matriarch shouted. Dead creatures that were once men pulled me up onto my feet, and I opened my eyes to see if there was any way to escape. There was not. They had my weapon, and the Zeppelin was far above me. "He touched the thing on his chest, and the rope went up," the daughter said, and she took a few steps towards me and put her hand on it. Nothing happened. She did not know that it only responds to me, and so she hit it again, but harder, and I winced with the force that rattled my bones. She struck it a 3rd time and shattered the dove, winding me. I coughed and wheezed and watched as the broken piece of the dove fell to the ground. John paused and looked at the floor before continuing. "I was sad to lose my dove. I will have to make another one in the future. Anyway, that doesn't matter now. On with my story." As I was held by the undead, the others stood or lay waiting for orders from their mother. The gathered women who followed the matriarch and her daughters recoiled slightly and stood off, watching things unfold. "We should kill him now," the matriarch said. "The things he has are of no use to us." "You saw what happened to Anne when they shot her," one of the daughters replied. "She lost her child. We are strong and do not suffer as much as these women when shot, but we need to protect ourselves. When the men of this world realize what is happening, they will try to stop us with all the power they have. The war will happen, but we need to make sure we live. This man knows things that could help us. He has a superior weapon," she said as she pointed to the pistol. "He might have more." "All right," the matriarch growled. "We won't kill him yet. Take him to the jail and lock him up. I will question him later. I want to explore my new army of living dead. I don't know how they live, but they are truly our slaves now." She laughed deeply. The sound was as coarse as sandpaper rubbed on my skin. Unsure what to do, I made no effort to resist, as several of the more whole undead forced me through the crowd of women to the opposite side of the main street. But suddenly they fell to the ground, unmoving. I was free. I took no time to wonder why they had fallen lifeless again, and ran. I sprinted back the way I had originally entered the town, and heard the cries and screams as I tried to escape. Glancing back, many of the women who followed the matriarch were coming after me, led by the 2 daughters. The matriarch watched on in confusion as the other undead around her still stood animated, waiting for orders. The ones who had escorted me lay limp. As I turned my head to look forward, I collided with what felt like a wall. Without knowing what had happened, I was on my back and looking up in a daze. Standing over me was the third daughter, who must have just exited the house to my right. As she came into focus, there was anger in her face, and I despaired for the cruelness of my luck, and once again gave up hope of escape. She seemed to notice the despair in my eyes, and I saw a flicker of compassion in hers, just before it vanished and her jaw clenched. "Hold him, sister," came the shout from behind me, but she didn't move. Before I could get up, the two other sisters grabbed me, and despite the swelling of their bellies, they reached down, and taking an arm each, locked me in their vice-like hold. "You are a tricky man," the one who had shouted said. "Help me take him to the jail, Charlotte," she said to her counterpart, who just nodded a reply. I stared pleadingly at the sister who had unintentionally stopped my escape, and who had, for a fragile moment, shown compassion in her face. She had to be Anne, who had lost her baby, but she looked away from me and crossed the street, ignoring me and all the women who had given chase. They stood staring with relieved looks, happy that I had been caught. The last thing I saw, before I was dragged away, was the matriarch smiling smugly, and walking towards me. As she drew close to where I had been hauled to my feet, the undead men began to twist and coil, and rose once again. From the look on the matriarch's face, she had surmised, as had I, that whatever trickery gave them a second life was coming from her, and she had to be close to them for them to animate. Then the sight vanished as I was dragged inside the building that was the jail and thrown into a cell. The two sisters then left me alone. I slumped down and thought about everything that had happened. As I did, several of the women came and posted themselves to watch over me. I ignored them and continued my contemplation. I quickly deduced that it was all to do with the electrical currents. Without going into too much detail, Vincent, it is known that all humans have an electrical current. This is what gives us life, and allows our hearts to beat, and our brains to think. Without electricity in us, we are just meat and bones. However, your father must have used a stronger or different type of electricity to give his creations life. On this world, electricity is a new thing, and it is replacing a lot of the steam power and power that comes straight from the raw materials. There are many other alternate worlds exploring electricity, and some have long past discovered it, and now have new forms of energy. But I have not seen a power that animates the dead. Sure, I had read it in tales and stories of how the dead had been given life, but to see it in real life takes my breath away and excites me. "Excites you," I said, "but you nearly died. It's obscene and against God what the matriarch can do." "Yes, it is obscene," John replied solemnly, but then he became excitable and smiled. "But it's something new, something that can be explored and used for good. When I report this to the other scriptorians, it will be decided how we move forward. But right now, my goal is to contain this problem, so no more of your people die." So where was I? He pondered with a stroke of his beard. "Oh yes, the electricity. Well, I guess that the animation of dead men was because of my weapon and the stunning pulse that hit the matriarch. It must have changed her electrical output, and whatever gives her once dead flesh life was now giving life to anything dead within close proximity to her. As I sat there in the jail with this realization, I wondered what another shot would do to her. And in that moment of panic, I thought perhaps it might increase the area of her influence on the dead. I hoped they would not wonder this too, and test it. But then I remembered it would not work for them, as only I could fire the pistol, so all was safe. For now Safe? You were anything but safe, I exclaimed. They had you locked up and were going to try and find out all your gadgets and your weapons so they could use them to kill more men. I suppose safe was the wrong word, John admitted, as I watched him become distant again. I truly scrutinized his face for the first time. There were fading bruises under his eyes and around his jaw, and the closer I looked, the more I realized he was covered in fading bruises. I gasped. "What did they do to you?" "Well, these were from my final escape. I nearly didn't make it, but that's for the end of this tale." "Are you in pain?" I asked. "I didn't even realize I still had them," he shrugged. "It seems I have become quite used to my face being beaten." I gasped again, and John went on to explain. "The first time they beat me was while they interrogated me," he said, shrugging, as if it didn't matter. At first it was the cruelest of the women who did it, but after a week of them asking me about my pistol and the rope that had vanished, the sisters who had been most vocal came to visit me. She was forceful and enjoyed trying to beat the truth out of me. "I'm so sorry this happened to you, John," I said, hanging my head in shame. It hurt me to think that he had suffered so much for my father's choices, and because I had not stayed to help him. "It's all right," he shrugged and smiled. "All part of the adventure, and just a downside to the wonders I get to explore." I was shocked by his casualness, but I guessed that his nature and his free spirit wouldn't let him dwell on the pain he went through. "So that was still months ago. What happened and how did you escape? And how are we going to stop them?" I wondered aloud.